Hey guys, Tommy Carrigan with Tommy Untamed. We've got a great show coming up. Thank you for watching. I've had you on for I believe most of your books. The one I think everyone knows is Making the Atomic Bomb. I love Masters of Death, S.S. Einstein's group, and I think that's a fascinating book. But what we were just going on about socialization, learning violence, and I just thought I think a cool guest to maybe pair you up with is my buddy E.M. Burlingame. I believe he's about 60, but grew up in the foster care system, I didn't. I've known him for about 6 months now. I didn't know that until the other day when he mentioned it because I had mentioned you and on a
Oh,
show
right.
and I never knew that, but he went into finance, and then he says his midlife crisis was he went into special forces, and he went
Oh, yeah,
overseas, and he talked about going overseas and killing people, and
right.
that's exactly what you were just talking about. There are you went down the path of probably the most constructive way of writing brilliant books. He went down a path of he did finance, and then he went into special forces, and now he's doing finance again. But about all these, and you were just mentioning the way doctors are treated. One of my favorite books, House of God by Samuel Shem, about the whole hazing process of Harvard Medical Best, they call it BMS, Best Medical School. And I don't know, you can't really see it. There's a column behind me. On the other side of it, I have two wooden paddles
Oh,
from
yes, yes.
December 2009, Hell Week of Pledgeship in college. And every day before the show, I meditate in that leather chair. And I just happened to look up at the paddles today. They've been next to me for over a decade, 15 years. And I don't know why above all days, I just started kind of reading them again. And
Uh,
it's all violence socialization. It's beating you into submission, and then
yeah,
how do you act? Do you fall away, or you know, do you condense with the other guys and you become the brother? And it's the whole blah blah blah. It's the hazing process. But kind of all of these different, I guess, thoughts and reality tunnels just in the last week are kind of converging on everything you were just saying. Which how do you socialize it? Do you commit suicide? I lost my brother to suicide. You lost your mother to suicide. Do you
yeah,
go into violence, be it gang violence or be it the more streamlined, accepted violence, but violence nonetheless of the military, or abusing others, or abusing animals, or
right.
I don't self sabotage through drugs and alcohol. But um, I want to kind of jump back over to really what you were just talking about. You and your wife kind of looking at these different programs. So before I rudely interrupted you a couple minutes ago, could you just pick up the
Oh,
thread and keep going?
we had to turn on the
Yeah,
recordings.
that happens sometimes. Where I go, oh my
Oh, yeah.
god, I'm 30 minutes in.
Excuse me.
You good?
Um, the point is, socialization is a pretty standard process that goes on in any line of work where there's a kind of a membership involved. Your example of fraternity hazing is a classic example. It's somewhat limited compared to some of these other
Oh
processes.
yeah.
Nevertheless, there is a way that you turn someone into a member of the fraternity by running them through the hazing process, which can be quite severe. But at the same time, and what is missing in most of the models of what makes people violent is the coaching part. That's the part that people seem to miss. Right now, there's a big move to try and make violence a kind of mental illness, forgetting the fact that we have all sorts of professionally violent people around who protect us. Are cops mentally ill? They go through violent socialization up to a point. Hopefully, not the point where they're prepared to use violence against people who are not threatening them. Unfortunately, we have quite a bit of that in our
Mm.
society. But ideally, you want people socialized, professionals socialized to become violent only defensively, only when they are seriously threatened by a credibly violent opponent, which of course goes on all the time in policing the streets and so forth. That's why we have police. That's why we have soldiers. and they're not mentally ill, no one would argue, I think, that case. And in fact, it turns out that if you look at the numbers, people who are mentally ill are not more violent than people who are officially not mentally ill, except in the case of people who use street drugs. And there, of course, there is a violent setting involved that would lead some people to become violent in the course of learning how to, well, around that situation. It's more so the reason for, let's say, someone who's diagnosed as mentally ill being violent is typically because they're involved in getting some kind of substance to treat themselves. So socialization, a common phenomenon, violent socialization, a specialized version of that phenomenon. There, the goal is not to turn you into a member of a fraternity or even a soldier or a police officer. The goal is within informal structures of family and street groups and so forth to make you someone who's prepared to use serious violence, even against people who aren't threatening them. In other words, criminal violence. And that process goes one step farther than self-defensive violence. That takes you to another level. And typically, when that happens, some things are typically then you get kicked out of whatever normal groups you're a part of because people are afraid of you. But on the other hand, as several of the violent criminals in prison whom my wife interviewed and worked with said, yeah, people get out of my way when I walk down the street, which is a way of saying, if you start out being violently dominated, being pushed around and beaten up and so forth by say, your father, or your mother. Mothers are very often the perpetrators of violent socialization within families because they're home all day. They're the ones. My stepmother was my violent socializer. Fortunately, I got away before I got that far. But she would beat us with whatever she had at hand, us, my older brother, and I. So the coaching comes from someone who is themselves credibly violent. You can think of the classic case of the drill instructor. You know, he's a combat soldier typically. And he, when he says, maggot, what are you doing? Stand up, drop down and give me 20, whatever they say. Uh, it's tricky these days because they're not allowed to beat you up, at least not officially.
Not that we know
So
of.
some of that goes on anyway, as
Yeah.
we know. So they have to use, it's possible to violently socialize someone without ever hitting them. If you're a seriously threatening person, the very threat is enough to move plenty of people into the whole process of becoming violently socialized. So the process involves, first of all, you're a victim. And this is where the victim business comes up in court and why so many people who have experience of violence, either as victims themselves or as defensively violent people, veterans, lots of American males are defensively violent. This is where they get sickened by the idea that just because someone has had a tough childhood, that they have to go out and kill someone, because that's not what they do. So lost track of that thought.
Violent social coach as opposed to the formal way of coaching. It's
The coaching
informal.
is the important part because it's in this process of not only violently dominating somebody, but also at the same time in a number of different ways, telling them the only way you're going to stop being pushed around and being a baby all the time is if you get tough yourself. The next time that bully picks on you, I want you to pick up a brick and hit him in the head. Or the mother who, in one interview someone did in one of the books that I've studied, says, "Don't come home without bringing me one of that bully's teeth."
Yeah.
Wow, what a terrifying thing to have to face. This brings up another issue, the question of becoming violent because you watch so-called violence on television or in play video games or whatever. What's missing from that story is when you reach the point in your violent development where you feel like you're big enough and strong enough or have the means at hand, maybe these days it's a gun, typically it is a gun in our society, that you think you might be able to dominate the person who's been violently dominating you. Then you hear the voice of that violent coach saying, you've got to be violent yourself. I mean, there are lots of ways to get out of having to become violent. My way with my stepmother was to spend all day somewhere else
Hmm.
and spend as little time at home as possible, which is pretty typical for a lot of people. Someone else may, as we said, decide that the only way they can get away from all this mistreatment is to commit suicide. That's a credible answer to the problem, although not a very happy one for the person who has to do it because they end their lives. But or maybe you go to the police. When my brother was being beaten one day by my stepmother, he was big enough by then, at 13 years of age, to think to himself, why don't I just take that baseball bat out of her hand and beat her? But he had been in scouts and he had been in church activities and he had heard the nonviolent coaching that we get from some of the better organizations in our society and most of the better people that say, don't use violence. That's not good. You don't want to do that. For whatever reason, you don't want to do that. He'd heard that. And instead of beating up my stepmother, which would have sent him off to a juvenile delinquents home, broken up the family. God knows what would have followed if he'd made the decision at that crucial point. Instead, he said to himself, I'm just going to get out of here. And he ran out. She chased him down the street, but she was overweight and couldn't chase him very far. He was a track star later in high school, my big brother. He ran a 420 mile when he was a junior in high school, which was pretty good.
That's insane
Yeah.
now.
So, well, for a high school kid, yeah. Anyway, we had happened to go to the police a few weeks earlier to get a license for our new bicycles, of all things. But in Kansas City at that time and place, you had to have a police license for your bicycle. So he remembered that. And after spending part of the day thinking, where can I go? And he couldn't think of anyone within our extended family whom he credibly knew would take us in. And he couldn't obviously go back to our stepmother. She beat on him some more, and probably seriously. But he remembered going to the police. So here he was, underweight because we didn't get enough to eat in that household, and bruised from beatings. He went to the police department and they had the good sense, even back in 1949, when there was very little in the way of social support for children in our society. They saw that he was underweight, they saw that he was bruised, and they started the process that led us to be removed from our family and sent to what was a very benevolent farm school outside of Kansas City in Independence, Missouri, which is still there and still functioning and still doing a beautiful job of taking kids in and giving them a good life. So that was an alternative and a really good alternative because I went with it. The judge insisted that whatever we decided to do, and he gave us several choices, we should go together. So I got out of the situation too, even though by then my stepmother was plying me with strawberries and promises of going to scout camp if I would testify that Stanley was lying, which I wouldn't. So, but I was terrified of
Yeah.
hers. Anyway, each stage of the way, if you can find a way to intervene, I mean, obviously, this is a very complicated process, but we'd have a lot more violent people in our society than we do. And our violent levels in American society are really fairly low. They're higher than in Europe by quite a lot. but they're not higher than Russia. They're not higher than most of the countries of South America and Central America, like Mexico. We have some pretty good control over violence in American society, which is largely, I think, a function of the relative prosperity of our society. People have lots of alternatives, and there's a reasonably functional social welfare system. It's not as nearly as good as it should be. For one thing, it doesn't have the right violence model. We still think that violence is some sort of steam boiler explosion, that it's all anger, that if you get angry enough, anyone will use violence, which simply isn't true. There are lots of reasons why people use serious violence. There's frustration if someone has money in their hand that you want, then you use violence to get that money. There's there is anger, of course. There's fear. If someone is threatening you and you feel that it's dangerous. There's also just taking care of business. As a friend we developed my wife and I, when we lived in Connecticut, who had been a seriously violent guy and had stopped being violent. I won't go into the whole story, but he was our barber. He cut our hair. And when we got his trust, he told us about a lot of his interesting crimes over the years, including kneecapping his partner in crime one time because the guy was holding out some of the loot.
Mhm.
So this was a serious guy. And when we told him the violent socialization model, it was right on. It was absolutely what happened to him, stage by stage. And every time I've encountered someone who is seriously violent, the model fits them. Even in the case of that book about the German Nazis, uh, guys in a different time and place assigned to kill Jews, they went through the same process basically. So, in short, there is a distinctive process that's unique to becoming violently socialized. It's not what was the motive, which is always the first question when some kid goes in to shoot up a school. What was his motive? Was he online hating Jews, or what was his problem? No, the reason is almost always exactly the same, and that is they want the violent notoriety that comes with being known as seriously violent. And of course, that's what you get, even if they shoot themselves at the end of their killing spree. That's what they get as a result of killing a lot of people. And it's very easy with a gun, even if you're not strong, even if you're not able to use personal violence physically and directly with someone who's threatening you. If you can get your hands on a gun, you can shoot all sorts of people. And all you have to do is pull a little trigger. You don't even have to get close enough for the other person to attack you. All right. So that's the process. The key is coaching. The stages are pretty clear. But then now, how do you intervene? Where do you intervene? That's what we went looking for. And we found a program for each of the stages of violence development that has been tried, usually typically by itself. They've never been pulled together into one integrated program. And that's what we were proposing to write a book about. Uh, these different programs have been scientifically studied and calibrated to demonstrate that they work. And that's one of the keys that we looked for as we looked for each one of them. Now, let me tell you what they are, because this is like not to prevent heart attacks on an individual, not to fix a heart attack. Someone has a heart attack, they have a whole process you have to go through with doctors to get that fixed. This is more like, how do you reduce heart disease?
Yeah.
You're not going to catch the most extreme cases. You're not going to catch the kids, let's say, who go home to get beaten up every day, unless you stop that. And that's hard to do because the home is still in American society kind of outside the political spectrum. It's a place of privacy still, less so than it used to be, but it's still a place where a lot of violence can be hidden and is hidden across the board, not just poor people, rich people in between, all sorts of people indulge in violence within the safety and the invisibility, not safety, of the home. Nevertheless, there is a way to get at the beginnings of violence in the home. So the first one we found was a program for reducing uh, hospital admissions of babies and children for intentional injuries, which is basically to say for child abuse. And this was a program that was tested and tried out uh, to send visiting nurses into the homes where there are newborns, particularly first newborns, the first time the mother has a child, to teach the mother how to take care of their child, how they prepare milk if they're not breastfeeding, how they keep the baby clean, all of the normal things that you learn. 1 hour a week. But the nurse was also trained to coach the new parent in not using violence against the child when they do things that the parent interprets as misbehavior. A lot of new parents, when a baby is crying, will tell you, "Oh, she's just being willful," and they slap her or him. So the nurse would say, "No, no, wait. Looks like maybe she needs her diaper change. Let's do that first before we do anything else." And that would solve the problem. Looks like she's hungry. Let's feed her. Looks like she's cranky because she's tired. Let's put her down for a nap. So that's violent coaching in this context. That's violent, anti-violent coaching, I should say, non-violent coaching. And this particular study found a 50% reduction in hospital admissions for the group under study for deliberate injury, just by this simple process of home visits. I'm writing a book right now about a doctor in New York in the time of the tenements back at the beginning of the 20th century, who sent nurses into homes to teach new mothers how to take care of their babies. I don't think they knew anything about what I'm talking about in terms of anti-violence coaching, but she's credited with saving the lives of 90,000 babies.
Dr. Joe.
Of course, yeah, Dr.
Yeah,
Joe.
yeah, I'd read the little thing you read on
Josephine
there.
Baker,
Yeah.
right, exactly. So this is something that's been done in the public health field for a very long time, certainly since the beginning of the 20th century. But it's just adding in this one component of nonviolent coaching that really was remarkably effective. And it was 1 hour a week, a minimum involvement, really, when you think about it, in time. So that's the beginning. That's the first one. That's really preventing violent socialization from even starting. But the program ended when the child was 4. And they followed these children and found that their admissions to the hospital went up when the program ended and the mothers were left to themselves again. Maybe there were others in the family, maybe the mothers themselves didn't get the point, whatever the reason. So then the question that my wife and I asked ourselves was, what programs are out there for older children, starting, let's say, with kindergarten or even preschool? And what we identified, and this is clearly not the only thing you could have, was a program in Vermont that was basically a family-oriented community center where they had some outreach to families in the home because Vermont is primarily a rural state, and a lot of the families were living in isolated circumstances outside of town. So they would go to the home basically to encourage people to come to the community center. And then people would also come on their own. They brought in representatives of all sorts of state social welfare departments, systems, to be there to help people who had any problems that they wanted to discuss. They had group therapy meetings for anyone who wanted to join them. They had, of course, entertainment and recreation. So here was a place. Remember, I said one of the ways I got away from my stepmother was to go to a community center in Kansas City, which was there all day. I could learn to do things. I could read. I could go to the library as well. But there was such an institution in my hometown at the time. I don't know if it's still there or not. That then begins to be a place where older children can learn, can be nonviolently coached, be shown how people normally relate to each other, be shown systems for relating to each other in a nonviolent way, like group therapy. And again, they followed the violence. Well, they were primarily concerned with teenage pregnancy when they set up this family. They reduced teenage pregnancies by 90%, first of all, basically by educating girls about what was going on when they had sex and encouraging them to think farther than just, I want to have a baby because I'm lonely. Uh, they looked at the numbers in various categories, including violence. And again, admissions to the hospital for violent trauma reduced by something like 50 or 60% in this particular place and time. And this was all studied by the University of Vermont Sociology Department. So again, it was tested. It worked, and there's evidence that it worked. That's the next one we found. Then we looked a little farther. What about as Dr. Lonnie Athens, who was the originator of this whole model of violence development? We've talked about Lonnie before. He teaches, I think he's retired now, but he taught at the University of New Jersey at South Orange. Lonnie said one time to me, it's hard to get in the home for the reasons we've already discussed. But everyone's in school all day. So the school is obviously the place to go to try to deal with anti-violent programs. So we looked for those, and the most successful one we found was one that has been organized and is in operation around the country, actually, by the Menninger Clinic, the mental health institution that for many years was based in Topeka, Kansas. They've had to move now to, I think, Texas to be closer to their people because of the way insurance rate systems have changed. In any case, they developed a system that was school-wide, that was organized by classes and classrooms, that they had a flag that the classroom with the least amount of violent disruption would get every month to show that they were the winners of this month's most successful class. They had these various programs. If there was a violent altercation within a class, the whole class stopped and they sat there and talked about what was going on and why, and whether that was a good idea and so forth. In other words, a kind of group pressure and group response to move away from individual violence towards some more collective and less violent way of handling the situation. It's been a very successful program, and so much so, as I said, that it's spreading nationwide. And it reaches people who are older kids who may be farther along in their violence development and gives them another place where the whole process can be interrupted. And since you really have to go through all the stages of violent development, violent socialization, in order to end up seriously violent, any one of these things by itself can do that job. Taken together, which is what hasn't happened, taken together, they should be quite powerful. Just as the methods of dealing with potential heart disease, better diet, weight control, we all know all the rules, blood pressure control, there are a whole list of things that are packaged together as how not to have a heart attack. And here, Ginger and I were trying to package together various things we found for how not to become violent and how to prevent children from becoming violent, or adults for that matter. So then, what about someone who's really begun to use violence, getting those first violent experiences, the bully, for example? Well, of course, the anti-bullying program, but one program that's remarkably successful, paradoxically, is is karate and similar personal. I'm blocking on the what we call this collective group of things.
Martial
But
arts,
sorry,
self-defense, martial arts,
yeah, the
self-defense.
martial arts, the martial arts. The martial arts you would think would teach you to be violent.
That's the
But
opposite normally.
yeah, but in fact, their whole message is don't use this to injure and hurt people unless you're seriously threatened. In other words, stop at defensive violence and don't use it there unless you absolutely have to. So there's anti-violent coaching built into the martial arts, and it's remarkably effective at helping people who are maybe on the edge of being seriously violent come back from that and find something that gives them honor and pride and a sense of belonging to a very special group, uh, with a sensei as a leader who sets the example, a credibly violent individual who doesn't use his violence. So there, it almost brings me to tears to think about how effective that system can be for helping people.
Mm.
In a way, that's what happens when the kid who's kind of the bully of the neighborhood decides to join the Marines, because although the Marines are a pretty violent group as such on Saturday nights at the bar, it's hard to hold them in check, if you will. Nevertheless, the military's way of stopping defensively violent soldiers from becoming criminally violent is to teach them a whole code of honor. I mean, there's a set of laws,
Hmm.
there's military law, and it's designed to criminalize violent behavior that isn't included in the system.
Well,
But there's also this sense of pride and dignity and honor and badges and ribbons and all sorts of good things to help you remember and to keep you in place as someone who doesn't use this skill set that you picked up and this mentality that you picked up in ways that are destructive outside the limits of the destruction you're supposed to be prepared to use to protect yourself and the people in your life and the people at home. So these are all methods. And then finally, two others that we've come across that we haven't explored as much, but would have had we found a publisher for this book. Uh, that's been the problem. Publishers don't really know what we're talking about, unfortunately. Uh, one of the publishers we approached said, I thought you wanted to write a book about a guy who had just successfully reversed his violent socialization. And we thought, where did you get that
right.
idea? We never said that.
He's seeing what
Anyway,
he wants to see.
there is a program at San Quentin in California, uh, to help guys in prison for violent crimes learn anger management. Now, anger management is a very limited set of nonviolent coaching that's unfortunately based on the wrong model. It's based on the steam boiler explosion model, if you will. It's based on the idea that anger is the reason people use violence. And it's one reason, but it's not nearly the only reason. The really serious criminals use violence in the course of going about their work, basically. They're not angry, they're not frustrated, they're none of those things. It's their job, as our friend who was formerly violent said, I'm just taking care of business.
Hmm.
That's how he thought of it. Uh, but be that as it may, something else is at work because this guy has success in moving people away from violent behavior. And the evidence that that's possible is that as violent criminals get older, they tend to reduce their violent behavior. That's for obvious reasons. They're not as strong as they once were. They have families they don't want, given, as Shakespeare says, hostages to fortune. They don't want to die and leave their beloved children or their wife or whoever behind alone. They don't want to go to prison again. There are lots of reasons why people who are violent criminals might become less violent as they age. And that tells you that it's possible to reverse violent socialization. Uh, that part of the program really has had very little. We didn't find any really big active programs around the country, but there was one in Chicago that was really very interesting. Chicago has taken violent criminals who got out of prison and are on parole and trained them to defuse violent conflict on the street corner, if you will. They're hanging out in the hood, and everyone knows they're dangerous people, or they were. And when something gets going and it looks like there's going to be a dangerous fight, they can step in and credibly, as credibly violent people themselves, step in and say, wait a minute, hold on. Let's talk this out. Hang on here. And are quite successful in defusing neighborhood violence because of their credibility themselves and because they're using these various techniques of nonviolent coaching. So here's a whole spread from birth to old age, if you will, of methods and systems that have been tried and tested and that work to at least deal with the larger group of people who are somewhere on the spectrum of violence development or declining from violence later in life. It's not going to take care of everyone. It's not going to get the people who are being seriously violently socialized, but it will catch an awful lot of people who are somewhere in between. And this is the final outcome of years and years, as you know, of my writing about violence in all of its forms, the history of violence, the development of violence, Dr. Athens' work in finding a credible model for how you make people violent, testing that model against the German violent Einsatzgruppen groups that went out to kill Jews and were so overwhelmed by the level of violence they were being asked to perform that they broke down, which was really interesting, which is the reason Himmler decided to find some other way
Mm-hmm.
to kill the Jews and invented the death camps, the gas chambers, not because they were more modern or more scientific or more efficient, but because they protected his beloved SS men from becoming
Broken.
suicidal alcoholics, from being overexposed to being killing people all day.
Heaven's Harvest Prepper Food. 72 servings per pail, 25 years shelf life. I've had the owner Clayton on the show before. He's a God-fearing, America-loving patriot. Get one of these, get a couple of them, throw them in your basement. It's good to have it, not need it, than to need it and not have it. If you don't want to do that, you can get their seeds. You can plant your own garden, so you don't even have to keep buying them. You can just get the goods and start your own, or you can even get freeze-dried fruits and vegetables like bananas, apples, strawberries, and raspberries. They support the show. It's an honest product. It's a good safety measure to have, and they keep my show free for you. So I'd implore you guys to please go to heavensharvest.com, use the link in the description, promo code TPC. Axios Fitness Coaching is a premium resource for holistic strength and conditioning services. Axios is best known for the Training Club, capital T, capital C, an exclusive community that prioritizes accountability, technique, diet, and nutrition. Everything you need to do to take action against the decay of the modern world. Whether you're looking to improve your physique, build strength, or just take care of your health and fitness, Axios will provide you with a solution that is effective and simple to execute. All you need to do is complete the intake survey, and you can see if you're a good candidate for the training club or any other of the services. And it's going to sponsor the show. So, one company falls off, another one arises. So if you guys like the show, you want to work out, throw the show a couple shekels, go take the survey. Thank you so much, guys.
Higher ultraviolet exposure is associated with lower mortality. The United Kingdom is a high latitude and low sunlight country. Researchers there collected data on over 360,000 participants in a study of UV exposure via solarium use. When compared with non-users, solarium users had 15% risk lowered of all-cause mortality, 23% lower risk of cardiovascular mortality, 14% lower risk of cancer mortality, and a 12% lower risk of non-cardiovascular, non-cancer mortality. In other words, all other causes. Quoting the researchers, our study adds to the growing evidence that the benefits of UV exposure outweigh the risks in low sunlight environments. A link to the original publication is available in the box below the video. Get some UV light this winter. Immerse yourself in the tranquility of the blue. Visit a Blue Room soon. www.blueroom.com.
I've brought that book up so many times on this show because I think that's one of the most just fascinating, right? The whole trope, and I guess it kind of comes from like, German engineering, like a macabre way is like, yeah, and then they became really efficient at killing.
Oh,
And it's like in the most weird, twisted, the path to hell is paved with good intentions. Like, no, it's not because of that. It's because I love completely ignoring the irony of, well, what are you doing? You're killing women and children.
yeah,
Weird enough, though, it's coming from. It'd be like if like World War II bombers got rid of like I don't know like the B-17 windows that look down. It'd be like if they got rid of those so they didn't have to see the cities they were burning. It'd be like
yeah,
I don't want my pilots to ignoring the fact of I get it, war's hell, but it's that's one of the most fascinating
yeah,
models to look at what it was. It's such a, and it's almost harder to digest. It's
yeah,
easier to digest. It's an evil empire of mad scientists killing people. You go, yeah, okay, sure. It's it's even harder to chew on. No, they actually did that out of love for their own men. That is like dividing by zero
yeah,
because
yeah,
you can. I think what makes it so difficult is because the average person can identify with that doing
right.
something out of love. Well, I put my dog down in 2020. It's not because I wanted him dead. I keep a picture of him next to my computer. It's because he was 17 and he was in pain. And
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
that's what's scary is if I just killed a dog, you go, yeah, Tommy's a bad person who abuses animals. If I said no, I put the dog down because it was suffering and I still think of him every day, you go, oh, I can identify with that. I think that's what makes,
then you can be, then you can become head of the Homeland Security
yeah,
if
yeah,
you shoot your dog.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I was gonna say, but that's I think what makes it so horrifying is 'cause you can identify that. And I was just thinking, as you said earlier, what happens when you walk down the street and people get out of my way? It's almost sort of the void stares back. It's at what point do you become the villain? And it's not right, but if you were to just kind of detach emotions from it and look at it rationally, you can see why people would become excessively violent in a sort of Pavlovian response. Well, they stopped getting hurt and they got the resources they wanted, maybe not needed, but wanted. That makes sense. It's you ring the bell and the dog's mouth waters. Well, you've trained it to do that. I think what's interesting is another thing you've talked about is the level of violence decreasing really from World War II till now in terms of total numbers and percentages. As a species, we are slowly moving from, what was the most effective thing 10,000 years ago? You got to be the most brutal. You wear your enemy's blood.
Yeah, yeah,
But over time, we have been moving away from that And has society been getting worse? No, life expectancy's up. Access to food and water and shelter is up. So I would have to say, on a meta level, there is hope to be had because we, as a mass of billions of people, are doing it, but we're
Well,
still focusing in on these outliers.
let me interject here just to say, I think the reason that we've seen this decline over the years in violence, this improvement in public health, which is now kind of under siege as we lose the vaccination system. But be that as it may, I hope we get past this stage, uh, has to do not because we've become better, but because we've applied science and its wonderful self-correcting methodology to these eternal problems that have plagued us since the beginning. Smallpox, and it's obvious with the infectious diseases and the epidemic diseases. I remember giving vaccinations when I was a medic in the Air Force to our pilots, cargo plane pilots, when they were beginning to fly to this strange place in Southeast Asia called Vietnam. In 1964, one of the last vaccinations I gave was bubonic plague, which was really strange to take this little glass bottle out of the refrigerator and stick a needle into it and withdraw a dose of bubonic plague
Put
and
it in
stick
another, put
in
it in another
someone's
human.
arm. But there, it was still endemic in Vietnam in those days. It may still be. But we have slowly moved toward protecting ourselves from the serious pains of living in this natural world by finding ways to at least alleviate them, if not actually prevent them. I mean, the great success story is we eliminated a terrible disease, smallpox. It's gone.
Mm.
There's some remaining in a lab in a vial, and that's it. Nobody gets smallpox anymore. And unless Bobby Kennedy has his
I
way,
say
we
there's
won't.
two samples. I think
But we
it's
won't. And we're working on polio and we're working on other diseases. So that area has very much been conquered by medicine and public health. But the area of human violence is still kind of floating around uncontrolled. It's still wild, if you will, as those diseases were wild. And getting at human violence is a lot trickier than getting at diseases because we're people and we're smart as hell and we have a lot of choices and there are a lot of us who want a lot of things and on and on and on. Finding a structure that will reduce human violence, we have succeeded a lot, but it's still there underneath. This is what really fascinates me. If you break down a society as inner cities are broken down, the violence reemerges. Violence was once the way we prevented violence. That is to say, families and clans and other intimate groups like that would threaten the next door intimate group. Don't you dare come over and kill one of our family members, or we'll come over and kill as many of you as we can. And they were credible and they believed it, and it kind of controlled violence. It didn't control it very successfully. And when the middle class arose, beginning in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the middle class basically said, God damn it, can't you find some way to deal with these violent people so we can go about the business of developing things that make money so you can charge us taxes? King, emperor, can't you solve this problem? And the kings and the emperors got busy and found ways to reduce the violence, primarily by access to courts of law. I remember a lawyer friend who used to say, I'm involved in basically a contest, It's not violent, usually because that's the way we set up the contest. But if it weren't for courts, you guys would be killing each other in the streets, which is true. And one of the aspects of intercity violence is that people in those settings don't often have access to law. The cops kind of stay on the periphery. There's no lawyers around. They don't have money to pay them, and so forth. So we've begun to find systems for preventing violence by finding alternatives that work reasonably well. And the law courts are the most obvious ones of all. When Louis XIV set up his court in Versailles rather than in Paris, he told all the nobility that this is where the business of the state was going to take place. So if they wanted to be a part of all the money coming into the state, they'd have to come there. But they weren't allowed, he said, to bring their weapons. And oh, did that make them unhappy. Oh, was there groaning about, oh, God damn it, I can't take my sword with me. What kind of weepy place is this? But that's where the money was. And so they reluctantly agreed not to take their weapons to Versailles. And that was one of the ways that the king reduced the level of violence. The church got involved in reducing violence. The church believed that violence, one aspect of the church, violence was against God's laws. And by working primarily on the wives of the nobility, the case I looked at and was fascinated by was Louis XIV's father, Louis XIII, whose mother, who was beaten every morning when he woke up for the sin of pride. He was whipped by a big, ugly guy whose job in the court was to whip the king's son to make him get rid of his sinful pride. So that when his father was assassinated when he was 8, Louis XIII, the Dauphin, said to his mother, she said, oh, look, all the people love you now. And he said, well, that's okay, but what I'd really like is not to be beaten. But it went on until he was old enough to stop it himself. He was 13 by then. I mean, again, you can see this as an informal system for turning people who are going to have to use violence basically as soldiers to be prepared to do so. But it was still hell on earth for the kids who got treated that way. And almost everybody got treated that way. I mean, the history of violence is absolutely fascinating. You can trace its decline over the centuries, and then you look into why it happened, and you find that basically it's just the kind of thing that I just described to you about finding alternatives, about nonviolent coaching, about grouping people with other people, and so on. It's the same system. If ever we could, my wife and I, and everyone else who has worked on these ideas, could get them out into the world, I think we could make a major difference. Because if you can change the lives of violent criminals just by teaching them anger management, which is a really limited set of changes to bring about compared to the larger one that we talked about of dealing with the whole of violent socialization, then what can you do if people are actually aware of these things? People actually have this model. One of the things that I've noticed over the years is people can walk around and look at violence, for example, day in and day out and still not get it if they don't have some personal experience of it, or if science hasn't found the underlying model that supports the behavior. So thus we have every newscaster in America looking for the motive for some kid who goes to school and shoots up his classmates so that he can be recognized as an authentically violent person and treated right, even if right means going to prison. Violent people, when they go into prison, have their rights in prison as well. So, well, I'm on my high horse, to be sure, because I'm so indignant about these things not being understood properly. I gave a talk at a at an author book fair one time, and there was a district attorney woman there who's become a great successful writer of detective novels based on her considerable experience in the law. And when I finished presenting the Athens model, she said, they're born that way. And everybody cheered and laughed me off the stage. Well, that's not true. I think it's pretty obvious it's not true. Even Hitler wasn't born to be Hitler. Hitler was born as an innocent little baby.
Yeah.
A father that beat him almost to death more
Yeah.
than once. And he learned violence the hard way, as people do.
Yeah, but I definitely can see the indignance and the anger, but I mean it's a noble thing to put so much time into. I'm sure, Joseph Lister was pretty indignant that no one believed him that we should clean surgical instruments, but it's a noble thing and eventually it does work. It is it's fascinating that it's the really the one tool or vessel because we can still see it in the natural world. Turn on
Yeah,
National Geographic. It's there's no what's right, what's wrong. It's who's got the sharpest claws, the thickest skin, who can kill. And for the vast majority of the biosphere, for the vast majority of the time the Earth has existed, with at least from single-celled organisms till now, violence is the omnipotent law, and it is it is on a percentage basis, it is wildly a deviation that we are moving away from violence. However, we are also the only thing that has moved away from nonstop hunter gathering. That has, I always
yeah.
use this example. I can go to the grocery store, and instead of going to another checkpoint, it's not like I have to bring a machine gun and eye them down. I go in, I don't even have to interact with anyone. Today I grabbed some apples, some chicken, some cauliflower, and some Tylenol. And then I took a plastic card out of my pocket and I put it into a machine. It beeped and I left. There was no checkpoint with my mercenaries and their mercenaries and we're eyeing each other up and down. So
But
it
if you
is.
tried to steal that stuff, there would have been,
Sure,
yeah,
but it
you
is fat.
exchanged
It's
something of value, a token.
but it's fascinating that the one small group of living organisms over the one small fraction of time of the whole biosphere over roughly 2 billion years since prokaryotes is also the only one that has a space station, that
Yeah,
has, the agricultural revolution written like. So we are seeing that it's almost like that. I don't know what Olympic sport it is where it's skiing and shooting, the rifling, and it's this weird dichotomy of you have to go as fast as you can to get to the point, but then you immediately want to drop your heart rate so that you're more stable. So it's this
yeah.
weird thing of what was the winning move for the first part of the race is now not only it's not the winning move, it's actually the worst move. Lay still, control your heart rate. Violence seems to get you to the point where you can start planting your own food 10, 15,000 years ago. And now it's like we're trying to lower our collective heart rate to do the next thing. It's a very odd, it's completely unintuitive, but it's like the less violent we get, you can start planting your own food 10, 15,000 years ago. And now it's like we're trying to lower our collective heart rate to do the next thing. It's a very odd, it's completely unintuitive, but it's like the less violent we get, the more advanced we become. But it doesn't mean that violence is a scourge because you have to be violent to beat out everything from like T-Rexes to eagles to sharks to get to the. It's a very odd. It's a
Well,
very odd polarity.
let's be clear about in the natural world, violence is used primarily for
For
food,
food.
defense of the nest.
Yeah.
And what's very interesting, I looked into this one time, I was intrigued. Animals don't kill more than they need to kill at a given time,
Except dolphins.
except in circumstances a foggy night, for example, or a pen full of sheep when the foxes come around or the wolves come around, when they're overwhelmed by prey, then there can be a kind of mass killing phenomenon. And there are several examples of this in the literature. I mean, the foggy circumstances are the most famous one because under those circumstances, a group of predators will just keep killing. But if they can see their prey, they stop when they have enough.
Mm,
Because why would they do more? So unless, of course, they typically winnow out from a herd the weak animals, the animals that are either isolated, like a calf, or an animal that's partly crippled and can't keep up with the herd. So there's an evolutionary process that kind of keeps it in balance. So in a way, I think killing for food, killing to defend the nest aren't the best examples of what you're talking
sure.
about. The best examples maybe are and, I mean, anyone who's listening is already thinking, well, what about war? You say we're so peaceful. Jesus Christ, they're killing it by the hundreds of millions over in Ukraine right now. I'm not sure about the largest causes of war, but I do know that the people who run wars are generally desk murderers,
Hmm.
people who do not themselves put themselves in position to be killed. They stay in a safe place. And under those circumstances, it's kind of like a fog. It's kind of like the animals that kill too many because they can't see the whole crowd. They're capable of aggrandizing their own violence level, being taken to be grandly violent in the largest possible way. Think about Putin and
Because
his.
it's not real to them. It's a piece of paper.
Yeah, they didn't risk anything.
Add another zero. What does it matter?
Well, that was Hitler's famous line, wasn't it? Or Stalin's,
Stop,
perhaps.
one death is a tragedy, a million's a statistic. Yeah.
So the desk murderers are the ones who are really evil, if you want to call them evil,
Yeah.
who can say, "Oh, kill another million. We don't care. Go ahead, knock them all off." And it's fine with them. It doesn't hurt them. In fact, to the contrary, it helps them, makes other people afraid of them at a level it's hard to conceive, except for all the billionaires that are hanging around Trump these days. And that's not even really serious violence. That's
Yeah.
just, yeah, control of resources. So there's something about the large scale war that I haven't gone to that. It's been hard enough to deal with private violence, much less the larger things that are involved. I mean, war used to be fairly straightforward. You were taking over someone's territory and you knew where it was and you knew what you wanted, and when you got it, that's where you stopped. Now I don't know, it becomes this larger game.
It's a large, and I almost wonder if it's scale dependent. Like a fire or something. You light a candle, or you have a fire in a fireplace, or you have a bonfire. But it does start to behave differently once you get to like forest fires, where
Yeah,
it creates so much heat and such an updraft, it actually starts to create its own wind. And then its
yeah,
own wind, as you know, through time, it starts making firestorms. And then it's almost, and but most of the fires like we all deal with are not forest fires. So
right.
it almost could be scale dependent, where once it hits a threshold of killing over a large enough area, it might not be the things we understand about, motive or upbringing or resource scarcity. It might kind of hit a frenzy. It's somebody who's angry or sad, and then there's hysteria, where it's like they're hyperventilating, they're going through tunnel vision, and you just need to remove them from
Yeah,
like the conflict and just talk to them.
that's really interesting. That's a very interesting way to think of it, I think. I would add that I think these days large scale wars have more to do with ideological transformations.
Sure.
It's pretty clear that Putin's larger goal, as he's made quite evident, is to reconstruct
Soviet
the
Union.
the grand empire that the Soviet Union, in his mind, once was. And that to do that, he has to actually conquer territory. And he's prepared to sacrifice not only as many Ukrainians, he doesn't give a shit about the Ukrainians, he's prepared to sacrifice his own people.
Mm-hmm.
400,000 people dead from Russia for this war of his. For what?
Yeah.
What will they have when they're finished? I mean, I always remember Eisenhower talking about why you would ever want to have a nuclear war in the world. He said, why? There'd be so many bodies, you wouldn't have enough
To get
bulldozers
them
to.
off the street.
In other words, he thought of war as something where you conquer territory. And why would you want to ruin the territory you're proposing to conquer? But this is something else here.
Mm.
There's another phenomenon, by the way, that is worth mentioning just because it's very much on my mind with India and Pakistan
Sure.
playing the world right now. And that is there's a new stage in deterrence theory that says if I have a nuclear arsenal, I can use that nuclear arsenal as a kind of cap to prevent you from stopping me from having a conventional war.
Yeah.
That's what Putin has been doing with his war with Ukraine. You don't hear as much lately, but certainly at the beginning, he was warning everybody off by
I'll start
staging,
lobbing nukes.
yeah, by threatening to lob nukes, by having war games involving his nuclear arsenal. It was all about stay away, or I'll do even worse things to you than I'm doing to these people you're worried about. So India and Pakistan started that process. They're the ones who seem to have invented this back in 1999 when they were fighting over the same damn territory they're fighting over now. Punjab, not Punjab,
Kashmir.
Kashmir, yeah, way up in the Himalayas. They were fighting up at 18,000 feet at one point. I don't know how anybody moved around. I got winded at 7,000 feet myself when I go to
I
Los
get
Alamos.
I get winded at sea level.
Feet, I have trouble giving a speech because I just don't have enough air. But people have different altitude levels that affect them. In any case, I'm thinking about this new phenomenon, which is really terrifying. Because if India and Pakistan actually unleashed what most people would think of as a small regional nuclear war, the same people who studied nuclear winter did a study of what an India-Pakistan war, where they only exchanged each 50 Hiroshima-sized bombs with each other, but exploded them over their cities, and found that it would change world temperatures, the average annual temperature, downward by 2 to 3 degrees, which sounds like nothing,
No,
but
that's a lot.
it's enough to cause 20 million prompt deaths from the fireballs burning down the cities, but about 2 billion deaths from starvation,
Yeah.
because crops couldn't grow under those conditions. So we're in a very precarious place again in the background of all this other stuff that's going on. And I find it most worrisome.
That you could hope that because people are aware of that, I would imagine people in the Pentagon are aware of that, and our DoD or Russian MOD or China's whatever, that might serve as a form of we have our own incentives to cap what's happening there, because I'm not too hopeful, but I'm just thinking hopefully you could look at that and be like, hey, I don't care if you guys all kill each other with guns. Let's go for it. But we're not going to let you start nuking each other because now that's going to ruin us. So if you happen to get a lottery chance winning and do a nuclear decapitation strike against your enemy,
Yeah.
fine, we're gonna come in there and kill all of you because of what that's gonna do to us. So you could almost hope that there's this sort of you two can go duke it out back in the backyard. But if you start wrestling each other and you break through my living room window, now I'm gonna come out with a bat. So you could almost it's an odd hope, but you could almost hope there are those selection pressures against it.
When this happened the first time, India and Pakistan in 1999, when they had this war before, Bill Clinton sent an arsenal of diplomats, our best people, over there. I mean, there really was panic in the State Department and in the White House. They realized the kind of risk that I'm talking about. They sent their best people over there to say, stop, don't do this. You're putting the world at risk. And they did stop. They backed off. But now, who have we got of
Yeah.
comparable skill running our government? That's what worries me.
Yeah. No, I
The
see that.
worst accidents are the ones that occur from multiple causation. Someone trips over
You
something, someone
stumble in
forgets
it, yeah.
a job, someone accidentally starts a fire in the wastebasket, and they all come together for the big conflagration. And I mean, I console myself only that we happen to live almost within sight of the big submarine base for the west coast of the United States. It's right across Puget Sound from us. So I know that if there were really a major nuclear war, we'd be inside the
You'd be
fireball.
immediately. Yeah.
And no, so
Yeah.
so
Hey,
in that
I'm a little less because I'm in Portland, Maine, and it's same thing. I always hope I hope it's big enough to get nuked because I don't want to survive this. It's I don't know if I'm close enough to Boston.
doesn't Portland have a major submarine base?
I think it has like a naval yard.
Uh,
So I hope I
yeah.
hope I'm close because if I'm not, I'm just far enough that I'm going to be in the absolute hell zone of New York and Boston. So I'm with you. Maybe I should go move within like eyesight of the Pentagon. Maybe that's the logical move. But
Yeah.
I guess, and we're coming up on an hour, so we can wrap it up. But I was going to say, and I try to come back to it more and more because as improbable as it is, it's still undeniable in that we've made it this far.
Yeah, it's
And
true.
it's, we can look back in hindsight of, ships with sails and planes and blimps and bombs and missiles. But at the time, no one knew that stuff. They were probably just as terrified with Sputnik or Hiroshima or the
Yeah,
Cuban Missile Crisis or 9/11 or COVID. They were just as scared. And they had all the same legitimate concerns about the apocalypse. And we've always found a way to, sometimes a little too close for comfort, skate through. It
yeah,
doesn't mean we always will, but we have thus far. In
yeah.
fact, we've never completely failed by virtue of the fact that you and I are here talking. So I kind of lean on that, and it's not a stable rock to lean on, but it's the only one I really have, and that's my safety blanket. Is I'm like we're still here, so
I'm a cockeyed optimist too.
yeah,
We're a clever species of monkey, and I think eventually we will manage to find our way past all this, actually. Not again because we're going to become better people.
no,
That's not,
no, no, no,
but we're going to keep working at installing the systems that we trust and test that do work
yeah,
to eliminate and alleviate all of these kind of violent things that are basically wild.
yeah,
You know, we're taming ourselves slowly, and let's hope we get there.
yeah. I think we
Yeah.
will. I think we will, and yeah. No, I mean, again, by definition, that we are here talking, it's worked out thus far. So it,
I would just tell you what Ed Wilson, E.O. Wilson, dear late departed E.O. Wilson said to me one time. Actually, he wrote it in one of his best books. He said, once we do all these things, and I think we will, said, I think we'll get past these problems. I think we'll reach a stable population and a stable world that doesn't have a lot of violence in it. Then we're going to come up against the final barrier, which is that we have nothing,
Purpose.
we have no purpose.
Yeah,
Our
you.
purpose,
That was the
all,
end of your book, Scientist.
all critters, is to reproduce our kind.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's not a bad purpose.
No, I think I'd rather come across that bridge of not knowing what to do now that we've achieved detail. I'd rather that and have
Yeah.
to, because then you could always, I don't know, create a photorealistic simulation and go run the human experiment again and play survival. I'm not entirely sure.
We stuff and paint stuff and
Yeah, I think it will. That will
um,
be a new form of like violence. Will be like creating the best music or best paint. Like that will be our violence.
I ghost wrote a book once for a psychiatrist and his therapist wife about how to make orgasm last 30 minutes. So there you are. We've got something to shoot
It's
literally.
yeah, no, we've figured out nuclear fusion. We figured out faster than light travel. We're going for the big one now. The eternal orgasm. The final. That's the answer to the Fermi paradox.
There we
That's
go.
why you've never found anyone. They're working on bigger bangs.
Oh, that's funny.
We will wrap it up with that. Mr. Rhodes, I always love talking to you, man. You're a cool dude. I love having you on, and I'm always grateful for your time. And I look forward to the next one, brother.
My pleasure too, Tommy.
Yes, sir.
Very
Thank you so much. Guys, please go in the description. Please go grab any of his books. They're all fantastic. I will send you this when it is uploaded, and I will see you next time, Mr. Rhodes. Thank you so much for your time, sir.
my pleasure.